Time now for our keynote today. I'm pleased to introduce Kate Gordon. She's Senior Advisor at the Paulson Institute and an expert on the intersection of clean energy and economic development. She's also a fellow at the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia University, and you may have seen her byline in the Wall Street Journal. She's one of the paper's energy experts. She's perhaps best known as the founding executive director of the Risky Business Project, and that's co-chaired by Michael Bloomberg, Henry Paulson, and Tom Steyer, and they're focused on the economic risks of unmitigated climate change. Please help me welcome Kate Gordon.
Good morning. It's great to be here. I'm just going to make sure this works. I'm sure it works. Thank you so much to the summit organizers. I am thrilled to be here in Boise. I love this city and this region, and also just to have such a great audience. I'm particularly thrilled looking at the earlier slide that this conference was convened by so many different types of organizations, particularly from the business community. We're here at a university, we have a lot of business support, and President Kushner said really well kind of the role universities play in thinking about climate change. Everything I'm going to say up here is based on research that comes from either academics or the business community. So these are really fundamental people and places and institutions looking at how these issues actually affect us every day and actually affect what I just thought the invocation kind of said so well, which is, you know, how we live with dignity on this earth. This is really why we're all here, and how do we do that in a way that's productive and where we can manage risks and we can seize opportunities. So I am here to talk about risk and opportunity. And you know, I've always been someone who's done economic development. So my background is not coming up from the environmental sciences. I'm an economic development person who looked at clean energy as a job opportunity, a way to grow jobs in regions, looking for kind of high quality, very place-specific jobs. And I got into this issue through that. But I got interested in climate risk specifically. Back in 2013, I was working at a think tank that several of our board members were investors from the hedge fund community, and a couple of the board members, Tom Steyer was one of them, came back from a Department of Treasury meeting that they'd had, and he had been with Jack Lew, who is the current secretary, and a number of other high-level folks at Treasury in DC, and talking about what are the big macroeconomic trends to look at over the next year. This happens, that happened by mistake. I didn't do that. Hold on. I need to be able to control my own slides here. I'll just do it from here. There. That happens periodically. And he came back and he had a whole day of talking about terrorism and cybersecurity and inflation trends and you know, aftermath of the global recession. And at the end of dessert, sort of Tom Steyer kind of said, you know, guys, are we going to talk about climate change? And everyone, he describes it as sort of patting him on the head and saying, oh, you know, that's such a nice little issue that you work on out in California. But you know, we're here with the big boys. Like we don't talk about that. So he came back and he sort of said, and we had a conversation where he said, what do we do to make this a conversation that the grown-ups in the room are having? What do we do to have an economically focused, business-focused conversation about climate change? So what we did was started a group called the Risky Business Project, and that was co-chaired, as you heard, by former Treasury Secretary Hank Paulson, Mike Bloomberg, and of course Tom Steyer, who at the time was running Fairlawn Capital. He's become a little more famous since then. As a climate activist. We also had, though importantly, a number of former CEOs. So Greg Page from Cargill, we had Jim Owens from Caterpillar, Rob Walton is up there, obviously from Walmart, and this combination of sort of former Treasury secretaries and former CEOs, we're in a perfect position to think about how do we evaluate risk to the economy? How do we evaluate it from a macroeconomic, running the economy standpoint, and from a running business and making investment standpoint? That project focused in on risk for a reason. So risk is the way that most of the folks on our risk committee think about planning for big issues. Many of you too in your everyday lives or in businesses that you run. You think ahead to what kind of trends you see, you do the research, you figure out probabilities, you try to adjust for probabilities. It turns out this is a particularly good way to look at climate change because it's not only is it good as a business kind of framework, but it's also good because like most other risks, climate change is not static. The risk of climate impacts change over time. What is today a 1 in a 100-year flood becomes a 1 in 20-year flood if we continue emitting carbon into the atmosphere. So it allows you to shift your profile and look at these tail risks and essentially plan for not only likely scenarios, but what they call tail risks, or low probability but very high impact scenarios. This, interestingly, turned out to be a very good way to talk about this issue to many people in the business community across the United States who weren't interested in having that political conversation about what causes climate change, and weren't interested in engaging in the how do we negotiate a new cap and trade bill in Washington, what's the policy solution, but really that ground of what are the risks and what do we do about it. Just to say a little bit more about risk, there's a recent task force that just happened. The G20 put together this thing called the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, which, this keeps happening to me, which, my slides are moving without my knowledge. I'm going to just watch them. Which is significant in and of itself because that the G20 put together a international climate risk task force. But I like this organization because it highlights that there are two kinds of risks that we're talking about when we talk about climate change. We talk about physical risk. So if you're a company, you're an investor, what are the risks to your supply chain, to your assets, to your investments from the physical impacts of heat, increased heat? Whether that's sea level rise, whether that's storm surge, whether that's wildfire, whether that's variable water resources. What are those physical risks? And then there's a whole other set of risks called transition risks. It's sort of a big category of what do we risk if we do not transition to a lower carbon economy? What do we as a business risk or a state risk if the world is moving toward a lower carbon set of technologies and policies and we're not? And how do we what do we risk by not doing that, and what are the opportunities in doing that? So I like the framework because it doesn't just point to risk, it also points to opportunity. In the Risky Business Project, we looked primarily at the physical risk part, and I'll talk a bit about that, and then I'll talk about, it's making me crazy, and then I'll talk about opportunities. And you have to excuse me because I usually slightly have better flow than this, but the slides are throwing me off a little. So we focused in on, if anyone can help me with the slides not moving without my knowledge, that would be great. I'm not even touching the clicker, just so you know. That one, that's the one I want to be on, this one. Anyway, so physical risk. When you do risk analysis, you have to plan for where you are, not where you want to be. Where we are right now, we're a little below this red line, but we're basically on this red line. This is where the emissions pathway is taking us right now. It's essentially taking us, you've seen all the dire statistics, toward a very, very, very hot planet. We need to get off that line onto one of the other lines. When we did our risk analysis, we did the analysis of the red line because if I'm at Goldman Sachs on the risk committee, if I'm a company with major physical assets, I'm not going to say, oh, well, I'm going to plan for the future where all of these possible things might happen that are cool policy initiatives that I've heard about that I like. I'm going to plan for what's happening now, and then I'm going to adjust my planning as policy and regulatory environments change. So we did we took that line and we did an extremely granular analysis, county by county of the United States, physical impacts from climate change over this century and actually into the next, but I'll talk about this century. And it's important because it was very granular. One thing we heard from our business partners was you can't do this at the level that, the National Climate Assessment, which I've worked on, but other assessments usually do, what NOAA usually does, which is these broad sweeping swaths of the United States with sort of color change. You need to get very, very specific because companies that have supply chains in specific places want to know the impacts on those specific places. So we went down to the county level on the heat map. This is the heat map. And one thing about this project, and I'll talk about other impacts besides heat because as you'll notice, you guys don't have the heat impacts that some of the other parts of the country have. My kind of aha moment about this is how incredibly local it is. So I feel like in the media and sometimes in policy debate, we talk about climate change as if it's this global phenomenon that we can't understand. It's existential. We sort of say, here in Idaho, we're only less than 0.5% of global emissions. How can we participate in this? This is giant, beyond us, right? It's all about China. In some ways, that's like saying, here in Idaho, we're only 0.5% of the global GDP, so why should we have an economy, right? It's not the most relevant factor. The most relevant factor is how are the impacts affecting Idaho and what are the opportunities in Idaho. This is a profoundly local issue. As you can see here, different parts of the country, different parts of our one country have enormously different impacts. Physically, we have incredible heat down in the southeast and southwest, storm surge on the Gulf Coast, sea level rise on the east coast that's different than the west coast, wildfire in the west. We have shorter winters in parts of the country. We have humidity in parts. It's extremely local. Different places are also react very differently depending on how they use energy and how they run their economies. If I'm in a place where I burn diesel for electricity as they do in parts of Alaska, I'm in a very different position when I think about transitioning to low carbon sources. For me, wind was economic 15 years ago because diesel was so expensive. But if I'm in a place that has hydropower, wind was not as economic 15 years ago. Today it is. So people react very differently and depending on where they are. And so, ultimately, as one of the people on our project said, talking about climate change in terms of US averages is like saying, well, my feet are in the oven and my head's in the fridge. So I'm average, I'm good, right? I mean, it just doesn't compute. So on first look, the Northwest, these 3 states, including Idaho, Washington, Oregon, seems to look pretty good. We have this one little kind of slightly orange dot there, but it's, the heat is not as extreme as in other parts of the country. I mean, it just isn't. And another thing I have to say about this project is, that was beaten into me, is you cannot have a conversation about climate change with anybody outside this sort of core committed climate people if you're not honest about what the impacts are. The fact is, the impacts in the Northwest are not as bad as they are in some parts of the country. It is true. Yes, there are specific, really challenging impacts, but when it comes to extreme heat, which is the big driver, it's going to be the big sort of migration of business driver in a lot of the country, that's not a big one here. We actually have, and you'll see, this is we did commodity agriculture yield for corn, soy, wheat, and cotton across the United States, and you'll actually see some yield gains in this part of the country. Yes, there are all kinds of questions about irrigation and adaptation and wildfire, all kinds of things you can say about that. But there's some opportunity for yield gain here. Labor productivity was a thing we did. These maps are all available online, by the way, so you can study them at leisure. Labor productivity is interesting because it affects the whole country. It turns out that the hotter it gets, the harder it is to work outside. Interestingly, this was the biggest economic impact of climate change on the United States economy overall. Generalizing was labor productivity declines. That's in high-risk industries like transportation, agriculture, a lot of construction activities. And you can actually see this now. So Phoenix, for instance, construction is happening at night in Phoenix a good part of the year because it's too hot during the day because they have people collapsing from heat stroke. So this is a phenomenon that will get more severe, and it is severe up here too. Energy demand is an interesting one. People like to contest this slide, but I put it up here for a reason. This is interesting. Many parts of the country that have that extreme heat impact have also reliance on central power plants and a need to cool those down when it gets hotter. Cooling down your plant, it's much less efficient. Using long transmission lines in hot weather is much less efficient. Your supply goes down, your demand goes up because all these people put in air conditioning and run it all the time. And in every part of the country except the Northwest, that creates big new demand spikes and big spikes in cost. The Northwest is not like that because of hydropower and geothermal, and it doesn't get as hot. So that's actually an interesting fact and one that I will turn over to you and talk about on the opportunity side in a second. I mean, of course, there are effects, as I said, that are very significant and severe here. So increased drought you've experienced, you've seen. More years that have extreme drought. Wildfire risk, you see all those lines going up all over the West. And what you have had a year and 2 years of extreme wildfire risk, so you know this viscerally. And actually, going back to drought for a second, the impact up here from drought is one that's very significant economically because water availability is critical for your hydropower. So you can't keep depending on that slice of the pie that's all energy from hydro. If the hydro resource is going up and down and up and down, it becomes less reliable, and your water supply becomes less reliable for agriculture and forestry. So that is actually a significant impact. I also always like to remind people that these parts of the country we're talking about don't operate in a vacuum. That map I had of the Northwest states is not like a self-contained economy that's on an island. This is Micron. I just chose Micron because it's obviously a big company here. Micron's earnings this year from mobile business are just going up and up and up. Mobile business, including the iPhone. The iPhone supply chain is, of course, global. And in a number of places where the extreme heat impacts are much more severe, even than that picture I just showed you of Texas. So these companies are not operating in one small part of the world. They're operating in a much larger context where they're looking at where are we putting our suppliers, where are we buying from, what are the physical risks on those places. This is the shipping destinations of primary wood products in Idaho. This is actually sort of interesting because it's both a risk and an opportunity. California is the biggest one. I'll talk about that later. But number 6 here down in the southeast, a lot of products going to the southeast. That is a part of the country that's experiencing extreme risk. And we're already seeing actually some migration of manufacturing from the southeast back up north because of some of these heat impacts. So this is not a problem for tomorrow. This is actually happening now. So this is Hank Paulson, turning to the question of transition risk. So what do we do about it? Or said another way, what are the risks of doing nothing? What are the risks of ignoring those physical impacts? But more to the point, what are the risks of not tapping into the fact that much of the world is moving in a direction toward decarbonization? Well, first you have to understand what decarbonization is, right? How do you get off that red line? How do we get off that red line? And then how do we use that as an opportunity? There's basically 3, this is sort of, many of you know this, there's 3 ways to decarbonize an economy. There's essentially, you switch to electric sources, you decarbonize your electricity you're using, and then you're more efficient. And I like to do the Michael Pollan version of this for anyone who's read Omnivore's Dilemma. I like to use electricity, not too much, mostly renewables, right? And then I will say here in Idaho, you have to remove carbon as a 4th one, because that is the 4th pillar. It just doesn't work as well with the Michael Pollan thing, but I should add that. So essentially, this sounds easy, right? It's a nice little haiku. It sounds easy. It's not as easy as it sounds. It does take operational change within the private sector. It does take policy change in the public sector, and it does take some upfront investment. The cool thing about decarbonizing your economy is that it's Greg Page, from a former CEO of Cargill, calls this substituting capital for fuel. Basically what you're doing is, instead of, let's say you use coal, which you use, I think, about 35% of your power mix. Let's say you use coal, and you have to build a coal plant, or you have to continuously pay for coal to come out of the ground, and then continuously buy it, and then continuously burn it. You're not only putting capital into your coal plant, but you're actually buying fuel year by year with contracts. The great thing about renewable sources, you know this from hydro and geothermal, but also with wind and solar, is you build the plant to tap into the thing, and then you never pay for fuel again, which means that your fuel savings eclipse your capital cost on these projects. That is not true on current projects. That is true in decarbonized projects. It's a very positive thing. It's why long-term power purchase contracts exist, because there's this savings over time where you can pay for these contracts. This allows for a ton of investment opportunities. So there's that upfront investment that needs to happen. There's all kinds of reasons that portfolio companies, the president was saying his son is now doing impact investing. I talk to impact investors every day. These are the things they're looking at. Where are the growing markets? And we're not just talking about here, we're talking about global. How is transportation changing? You all in this room know that transportation is going through a sea change. Not necessarily because of climate change, but because of all kinds of things: electrification, automation, shared vehicles, different driving patterns. Transportation, energy, coal is going through a sea change. All kinds of these things are moving, and there's opportunities to take advantage of where they're moving to and look at what climate's impact is on those. The opportunities to do that are not, it's not like we wake up tomorrow and we say, we got to transform our entire economy right now. Right? I used to think about this when I had kids, where everyone would, you get pregnant and you start freaking out about things like child-proofing. And then you're like, oh, my child's actually not walking for a fair amount of time. Like, I don't actually need to child-proof tomorrow. I can put this kid like in a basket and then figure it out over time. This is also true. You don't need to wake up and climate-proof your economy. You need to take opportunities that are already there, investments that are already being made. It's not necessarily new money, it's redeployed money. And that's true whether you're a state or whether you're a company, whether you're an individual. I personally just had my 1994 Volvo station wagon die, and I bought a Chevy Bolt. Like, that's a capital stock turnover moment. I want to make this point really clearly about the market, because I think we often get caught up, just like we often get caught up on how much emissions do we actually produce here in Idaho. We get caught up on, oh, but the US isn't in the Paris Agreement anymore, and we don't have a carbon bill here, so we can't really be part of this. And I just want to really underscore this point that was made earlier, that the market is moving. We are not in charge of this. This is a global market. Idaho is not a first mover here. We have natural gas, incredibly cheap. Hydraulic fracturing opened up all kinds of new resources. This is what happened to coal because of that. This wasn't because of a climate policy. This was because of commodity energy market drivers. This is happening. Coal plants are going bankrupt, and utilities that aren't on board with climate change are switching away from coal because of this reality. The global market is moving on carbon. We have, as you know, every country but this one in the Paris Agreement, which requires that we get to 80% reductions in emission by 2050. The important thing about that agreement is that people are now acting on it because they've made a commitment. 40 countries and 20 jurisdictions have prices on carbon in this world. 40 countries and 20 jurisdictions. China's is the biggest, and it's coming at the beginning of next year. China is talking to California regulators about linking those markets. I was just in Oregon yesterday. Oregon is talking to California about linking the markets. California is already linked to Quebec and already linked to Ontario. That is a large carbon market with offsets, with opportunities for sales, with opportunities for technology, with opportunities for deployment. That market exists without Idaho right now, but you're near it and you can sell into it. It's something to look at. China has decided not to sell, essentially not to manufacture anything but electric vehicles by 2019. So they will not make any internal combustion vehicles after 2019. 10 of the top 20 electric car companies in the world are Chinese now. If anyone follows the wind markets, you know that what happened with, solar markets, you know that solar prices have gone way down. One of the big reasons for that was that China got into manufacturing solar. China gets into manufacturing something, and all of a sudden, a lot of it exists, and generally the prices for it go down. That's an opportunity. Market growth, it's an opportunity to sell into. We actually sell electric drivetrains to China for their electric vehicles, so for Michigan, it's a huge opportunity. But it's also something to watch. It's a moving market that we either take advantage of or we risk not taking advantage of. Idaho has some really, really interesting particular opportunities in this space. And I'll just talk about them for a couple minutes. Idaho, doing what I do, which is economic development, right? You come into a state and you say, what are the assets? What does the workforce look like? What's the existing economy? What is the energy system? And you've got some really, really interesting opportunities, both because you're not as at risk. And I'm sure there's scientists in here who are going to argue with my whole thing about the Northwest not being as at risk. But from an economic perspective, the fact that the energy system up here is pretty clean is actually a big economic opportunity. And that you're not going to have that go way down because of heat impacts is a big economic opportunity. It's also a driver because it means that your hydro will be more variable, and it's an opportunity to invest in other things to shore up and make that system more reliable. So what are some of the big opportunities I see here? I love this top picture of the house because it's a cross-laminated timber house that is designed to fit in a parking space, which I just think is the coolest thing ever. The bottom floor, I think it's like the bottom floor is workspace and kitchen, the middle is bedroom, and the top is a greenhouse. I like this picture because it's made of cross-laminated timber. Cross-laminated timber is a very exciting building supply material. A lot of countries are looking at it as a way for smaller buildings below 20 stories, but it might get bigger, to replace steel. Steel is incredibly carbon intensive, it's expensive, it's a variable commodity that the cost goes up and down all the time, and it costs a lot to move around. So countries that are looking at reducing carbon impacts are looking at replacing steel, and they are looking at cross-laminated timber. What's great about cross-laminated timber? Well, it's great. It's a great thing to think about as a market for a state that has a lot of trees and a wood products industry with educated workers that know how to do this stuff and access to Pacific markets, all of which Idaho has. So looking at that, I think is really, really exciting. Carbon sequestration in land and forests, one of the big things coming out of all these international discussions about climate change, getting off that red line, is how do you get off that red line? You do the things I just said, right? I mean, I said earlier, you use electricity, not too much, mostly renewables, but then I added remove carbon. There's a big wedge of that that's literally getting carbon out of the air because we cannot get where we need to go if we just keep limiting our carbon, but we'll leave everything that's already up there. There's interesting ways to do that. There are technologies to do that that are commercialized and deployable and tested for millions of years, which are called trees. So trees are something that are actually already in place, machines for removing carbon. Carbon sequestration right now is not that valuable, except people do it where they can get offsets from carbon markets to do it. And in places where carbon has a value, people are starting to pay for carbon sequestration. Once again, that market I talked about, that carbon market I talked about that's getting bigger and bigger, that's very near here, is a place that does that. Also in land, I'd be remiss, I'm from Wisconsin originally, and I am embarrassed to say that I love anaerobic digestion. It's like one of my favorite technologies. We love cows, I heard that they're about to change our state slogan from America's Dairyland, which is terrible, so that needs to be fought. But anaerobic digestion is very exciting. I mean, this is a way to both, land practices can help with carbon sequestration. Anaerobic digestion can also turn carbon back into energy. And it's a great opportunity here. There's a lot that can be done here with that. I also have here, obviously you have geothermal and hydro resources, which again are important. There are parts of the country, and again, California, I keep talking about California because it's a big market. It's the 6th largest international economic market, and it's very near here. And California just passed a bill that is called the Buy Clean California Act, which requires that any building materials procured by the state, that they meet a certain carbon standard for their life cycle. So California is now going to prioritize buying materials from places that have clean power powering their electricity. Washington State's about to introduce the same bill. And it's something that that a number of European countries are starting to look at too. It's in some ways sort of an end run around a border tariff on carbon, but it's interesting because what it does is gives those states that have clean power already and the ability to do manufacturing and that are nearby so that their transportation carbon impact isn't that high, a huge competitive advantage. So we think that that's going to really spur a fair amount of manufacturing up here in the Northwest in all 3 states. That's something that this state has as an advantage. And finally, down here we have a guy working on energy efficiency. Grid modernization is something to look at in this state. This state everybody has an aging power grid. There's a lot of opportunity and jobs across the state, not just in urban areas, in shoring up the grid. You're already going to spend some money on this. This is one of these capital stock moments. You're going to spend money on the grid. It's time to spend it well, to think about grid modernization, and specifically to think about how to adjust for hydro being more variable in coming years, for coal going down and needing to replace that supply, for gas being a volatile commodity, obviously, that has ups and downs, and for the ability for this state to put in massively more renewable resources, because you are blessed with renewable resources and the ability to get them onto the grid. Grid modernization helps you balance all that load, and it's also something that those technologies can be exported to other places that are trying to do the same thing. So there are all kinds of opportunities here in Idaho. So will you capture the opportunity? This is the question. This is an Idaho high school rodeo competition. I had a great business dinner last night, and after last night, I almost changed this picture to steelhead fishing in Lewiston. But, which I was like, oh, I should have done steelhead, but rodeo's pretty good. I'm a rodeo fan, so. Will Idaho capture the opportunity of these growing markets, these climate trends that are happening regardless of the policy you're putting in place? These markets that are growing regardless of the policy you put in place, will you capture that opportunity or risk leaving it behind? Well, capturing it does mean action. Some of this is just kind of looking at the markets and tapping into them, but some of it is doing some policy change and thinking about policy change in Idaho, whether that's figuring out ways to internalize the cost of carbon, and that could be through incentives for carbon sequestration. It could be for incentives for renewables. There's all kinds of ways to do this. Not subsidizing risky behavior. So not putting stuff in place that's a 30 or 40-year investment that's going in the opposite direction of what we just talked about. Not putting yourself on that red line deliberately is a really important piece of it. Streamlining investment, really getting together in a room, the people who do economic development, permitting and siting, and the environment people, and getting everybody to sort of streamline some of this stuff so that we can build it more quickly and we can build it more efficiently. And then obviously dealing with those negatively affected by the transition. You are going to have some negative effects. You're having them already in terms of water supply, in terms of wildfires. And it is government's role to think about that in those transitions. But there's also operational change. And when I say operational change, I'm actually looking at everyone in this room. This isn't just about the government. It's not just about multinationals. It's about, it's like I was saying with my, new car purchase, right? Or it's about you if you're on a board of something, or if you're an investor, or if you run a business, or if you, go to a church with people who run a business, or the church as a business. You got to do operational change to get ready for this, because you yourself face these risks and opportunities. So we always say, a lot of companies are doing. Microsoft has done this. A number of other companies have put an internal price on carbon just to know what it means to have a price, because the prices are growing all over the world and they want to be ready. To having a goal for your organization of what your emissions should look like, to have an action plan, ideally to disclose that. It's the single most important thing to investors, is to know what your business is actually doing. And I'm telling you, I am seeing investors start pushing on this, and shareholders all over the country and all over the world. These shareholder resolutions are starting to push companies in a direction where they need to say, here's my risk operation plan, here's what where I'm putting money on the table. And then there is a role for you as people and as businesses to talk to the policy side and make these things happen. This is just not a problem for tomorrow. This is something we all need to think about now. And this is, again, Greg Page from Cargill talking about, the changing climate will present new risks and new opportunities as we face the complex task of producing enough food, feed, and fuel for a world on its way to 9 billion increasingly prosperous people. I would add, and also for 9 billion people, many of which whom are going to be experiencing these physical climate impacts more and more every year. How do we deal with that? How do we think about those impacts? And how do we here in Idaho take advantage of our assets and prepare for our risks? So let's not wait till tomorrow. Let's do this. Thanks, everybody. And I went over my time, so I would have done questions, but I'll be around.
And we are just on time here. Great. Wonderful to have that global perspective, also that economic perspective. We're going to narrow in a little bit on Idaho. The next panel is Risks and Impacts, Water, Land, Health, Businesses, and Communities. And I'll be joined by our presenters. Great. So I'm introducing Heather Kimmel. She is the Executive Director of the American Lung Association in Idaho here, and she's also a faculty member here at Boise State University and serves on the Board of Directors of Conservation Voters here. Also, Bryant Keekley, he is the Northwest Area Manager for the Langdon Group here in Boise. He's a recognized senior level facilitator with the Oregon Consensus Institute and the Institute for Environmental Conflict Resolution, and works with a diversity of stakeholders, often with opposing viewpoints on a range of issues to resolve conflict. So for that panel, Risks and Impact, Water, Land, Health, Businesses, and Community.
Thank you very much. As mentioned, my name is Bryant Keekley with the Langdon Group. We're a division of JUB engineers specializing in collaborative action and dispute resolution. We want to take this opportunity to share some great data that was developed for us today. And if you take a look on your table, everybody should have a stack of this Idaho at a Glance handout. This was developed by the James A. and Louise McClure Center. The University of Idaho's James A. and Louise McClure Center for Public Policy Research debuted in 2007. It's a champion for state water rights and a nationally recognized leader in energy and natural resources. Senator McClure earned the respect of his colleagues for his thoughtful pursuit and promotion of bipartisan collaboration leading to enactment and execution of sound public policy. The McClure Center's collaborative and interdisciplinary approach to addressing society's complex issues sustains the Senator's remarkable legacy. So we want to thank our friends at the McClure Center for putting this together for us. If you have an opportunity or you're not aware, take a look at the McClure Center website. They produce these Idaho at a Glance documents on a regular basis. take on different issues in Idaho, and it's a great snapshot of various issues that we're dealing with here. So in advance of this summit, they focused their efforts on climate change. Researchers at the University of Idaho compiled some data. So we want to take this opportunity to share some of this data with you, and then at the conclusion of that, we're going to look to some business leaders in the room and get some feedback from you as far as, what does that information mean to you and how are you reacting to that in your world? Kelsey, all right, we're going to get a presentation going here. Okay, great. So the information is broken out into 3 key focus areas: wildfire, water, and human health. So I'm going to discuss share some information from the wildfire and water sections, and Heather's going to discuss human health. Wildfire climate and precipitation are connected. Earlier spring snow melt coupled with warmer summer temperatures result in drier vegetation and a longer period of fire potential in forests of the Northern Rockies. Earlier drought conditions also slow forest growth. Increases in the fire season length could have major consequences for the wood and paper industry, which contribute $1.3 billion to Idaho's gross domestic product. Fire also leads to loss of historical buildings and monuments. The western U.S. wildfire season increased from 5 months in the 1970s to 7 months today. Since 1986, longer, warmer summers in the western United States has resulted in 4 times as many major wildfires and 6 times as much area of forest burned compared to 1970 to 1986. The average time span of large fires has increased from 7.1 to 37.1 days. Warming since the 70s has been responsible for about half the increased dryness in western U.S. forests. The number of acres burned in the western U.S. doubled between 1984 and 2015, adding an extra 10 million acres of charred trees and an additional 10 million acres of fire activity, equivalent to 1/5 the state of Idaho. A changing climate can facilitate invasive species growth. Invasive species such as cheatgrass increase fuel loads in grassland ecosystems and contribute to fire frequency. Yellow star thistle alone has led to more than 12 million per year in negative economic impacts for the state of Idaho. Drought heightened by warming temperatures weakens trees and increases susceptibility to bark beetle attacks, leading to increased fuel loads in the forest ecosystems. So concerning water, climate impacts water availability and water temperatures reflected in changing stream flows. Spring snow water equivalent in drought habitat. Water-based recreation is an important aspect of Idaho's economy. Concerning water availability, at most locations across Idaho, substantial declines in spring snow water equivalent have occurred over the past 50 years. The largest losses occurred below 3,000 feet, consistent with temperature increases during winter and early spring. Observations compiled from stream gauges across Idaho show a 15% decrease in cumulative annual stream flow over the last half century. Concerning bull trout habitat, in the Boise River, 10 to 20% of stream habitat was lost between 1993 and 2006. With increased water temperatures impacting adult spawning and juvenile rearing, stream temperatures increase in recently burned watersheds, further limiting bull trout habitat. Water-based recreation in Idaho is also, as I mentioned, a huge economic component of our state. It supports 37,000 jobs and generates $154 million in annual state tax revenue and produces $2.2 billion annually in retail sales and services, accounting for more than 5% of the gross state product. So again, that's a quick snapshot of those 2 categories. I'm going to turn it over to Heather, who's going to dive a little bit deeper into the human health component.
Thanks, Bryant. Good morning, everyone. The changing climate also impacts our health. Higher temperatures lead to more wildfire, more days of extreme heat, more air pollution, and more heat-related illnesses. And these impacts reduce workforce productivity, increase healthcare costs, and in the case of wildfire, cause property damage. Increased heat impacts health by worsening existing underlying health conditions, particularly for those with heart disease, lung disease, and kidney disease. And heat also impacts one of the other big risks to Idaho that we've already heard about this morning, and that's wildfire. Wildfires impact our health because of the immense amount of particle pollution they put into the air as the fires burn. The smoke from wildfires is a mixture of carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, water vapor, particulate matter, and other organic chemicals and trace minerals. And exposure to this smoke can cause serious health problems ranging from pneumonia and asthma, and also heart attacks and other cardiovascular episodes. But outside of its impact on wildfire, heat also increases ozone pollution and leads to increased pollen and other allergens in the air. And this can lead to increased asthma and allergy prevalence for people in those areas. And these health impacts are incredibly serious when we keep in mind how many people in Idaho have some of these underlying health conditions. For example, over 300,000 Idahoans today have asthma, COPD, or lung cancer. And another roughly 90,000 Idahoans have heart disease. So they really do feel these increases, and this is a pretty significant number in our population. And in all these cases, it's our most vulnerable citizens that are at risk. It's our small children, our pregnant women, our older adults, and those with underlying health conditions. But it also impacts people who are working outside. So it impacts our agricultural workers, our construction workers, our first responders, our parks and maintenance staff, just to name a few. It also impacts those many people in Idaho who live here in part because they love to do all of the outdoor recreation opportunities that you all know and love as well, I'm guessing. Outside the realm of heart and lung health, though, a changing climate also impacts disease vectors. The McClure Center specifically comments on West Nile virus. Increased temperatures increase the distribution of mosquitoes that carry West Nile virus. And above average temperatures are thought to be a key reason that West Nile virus migrated to Idaho, Washington, and Oregon from the East Coast. And in 2006, when the West Nile virus actually peaked nationwide, 93% of the cases in our country occurred here in Idaho, which is a pretty significant impact. The McClure Center notes, too, that the changing climate doesn't just impact our health, it impacts our way of life and our culture. The changing climate threatens Native people's access to traditional foods like salmon, game animals, and wild and cultivated crops that have provided their economic, cultural, medicinal, and health benefits for generations. And as the climate changes, it impacts the recreational offerings Idaho is known for and that play an important role in our economy, our whitewater rivers, the fly fishing, skiing, hunting, and the like. And these activities are also what make many of us love living in Idaho, too. The themes that Brian and I shared with you just very, very, very briefly and that are in the overview from the McClure Center at your tables are things you're going to be hearing a lot more about over the next couple of days. And over the next few hours, you're going to be kind of digging into these details and hearing from local and national experts on these topics. Before we move into those panels, though, we have asked a few participants who are here in the audience today to take a few minutes to share with us a little bit about what they are already experiencing in their own sectors, either personally or professionally, in terms of impacts from climate change, just to start getting a more tangible sense of what people are seeing locally here in Idaho. And before we do this, I just want to thank the people that we've asked to do this, because a lot of them got a random email out of the blue from me, somebody they'd never heard from before, asking them to do this for us here first thing this morning. So we're grateful for the good sports who are about to do this for us. And I think that I see we have a couple microphones here ready to go. So, Lynn, I'm going to ask you, if you don't mind, to start it off, Lynn Sprague. And if each person, as they stand up, if you wouldn't mind just sharing your name, your affiliation, and a little bit about your area of expertise, and then talk with us a little bit about how you already see climate impacting what you do.
Thanks, Heather. My name is Lynn Sprague, and I'm a forester, an unrepentant forester, I'll say. And my passion is the health and sustainability of these great forested landscapes in the state of Idaho. I'm one of the older people that Heather talked about a minute ago, so I've been around a little while, and I have seen the changes. I've seen the difficulties that we have in facing up to thinking about those landscapes that are not healthy, and what do we do to restore them. Thinking about once we have fire, what are the mitigation measures and how do we finance that and take care of it in a timely way to protect the water and the soil that has potential for leaving us quickly. And how do we think about doing a better job of initial response to fire so that so many of them don't get to the size that they have in the past. We're going to hear about all that this next couple of days in more detail. But to me, the biggest challenge is how do we, well, let me back up just a second. We have these large fires, for example, and affects our health, it affects our view of the landscape and so forth. But once the smoke disappears, our thoughts go to other things, our thoughts being the general public, and we forget about it till the next round of smoke lays down in the valley here. So the challenge is, how in the world do we who have this passion about, those of us here in this room that have this passion about this, how do we sustain some understanding and knowledge in the general public about these things such that those that are voting for the people that we send back east and so forth can do that in a responsible way and help us with the needs we have going forward? Those are my quick thoughts, Heather.
Thanks, Lynn. Juliet Marshall. Do we have Juliet here this morning? Great.
I'm with the University of Idaho in Aberdeen, and I work in production ag. So I work a lot with growers, and I work a lot with the diseases and the impacts in agriculture. So we're seeing a lot of different impacts currently in Idaho agriculture. When I first came here 25 years ago, we really never had a lot of opportunities to worry about diseases. And as a pathologist, it was pretty simple to me, crop rotation and proper irrigation, and the grower would never have to call me. However, over time, we've seen a complete shift in the disease pressure and the insect pressure in commercial agriculture. We're looking at increases of 2 to 3 times pesticide applications in production agriculture. So the ability to control weeds, diseases, and pests are huge. And we're actually facing an increase in diseases that actually are associated with mycotoxin production. So mycotoxins is a huge human health concern, obviously, not only for women, children, men, but also for our livestock. So these toxins also are impacting the ability to produce healthy livestock. So not only are we looking at disease impacts, we're also looking at irrigation impacts, and it's pretty obvious that conservation of water is hugely important in agriculture, and the impacts that changing temperatures have. If you think about it, plants can't pull up their roots and move to cooler climates or move to a more comfortable zone. So you're looking at high temperature shocks, low temperature shocks, impacts on pollination. High temperatures are going to impact pollen. It's going to decrease the ability of plants to pollinate, okay? So, and influence the ability to grow, say, spring wheat during the summer, as well as shift the production to winter wheat. So there's a lot of different impacts in crops, including higher nighttime temperatures, the ability of potatoes, for which Idaho is well known for, to produce a healthy crop, potatoes and sugar beets, sugar accumulation, bulking occurs during cooler nights. Warmer nights impacts our ability to produce a healthy crop. Now we can move the crop, but moving the infrastructure associated with that, sugar beet processing, potato processing, is far more difficult. So those are some of the impacts that we're seeing in Idaho agriculture.
Thanks, Juliet. And I have to apologize because I am going to mess up this nice gentleman's last name. Dave McCarricher? McCurcher?
Yeah, McCarricher.
McCarricher. See, even the third time I wasn't going to get that.
I was like 12 years old before I could even spell it. So I teach here at Boise State, and for the last 5 semesters, I've been a discussion leader for a University Foundation's 100 Thinking About Climate Change class. So every year we have about, or every semester we have about 200 freshmen. And the goal of this class is to think about climate change through as many different disciplinary lenses and through different careers as possible. So we bring professionals from the outside community and then from different departments on campus to talk about climate change. And I'll admit that when I started this, I was pretty new to the subject. I knew the basic story, but I didn't know a lot of the facts, especially not in relation to Idaho. And it's been getting more and more real for me as I've been doing it. For instance, I did not realize that the fire season has increased by 2.5 months in the last 20 years. That the fires, maybe that's, I've seen the numbers vary by about a half a month, but between 2.5 to 2 months, the fire season has widened. And along with that is, so warmer summers has also meant earlier warming in the springs, which means increased precipitation, which, I mean, initially that sounds like a good thing, right? Like, oh, more water, right? That would be good, in a desert. But really what that means is more snow melt earlier in the year, which means that we're not able to save that water. It just runs right past us. So if you're in the Boise area, you might have seen the river in the spring, and the river height was ridiculously tall. It was flooding on the Greenbelt. And we just had to let that water go. We weren't getting that later. So water conservation, which you've talked about, seems like a really important topic. And so one of the things that my students think about incessantly is, okay, we've heard about the science already, we've heard about it from all these different disciplinary lenses, but let's talk about solutions. Let's talk about solutions. Tell me there's more I can do than turn off the water in the shower earlier. And I'm interested in questions like, what are we doing from both the private and the public sectors, within the private and the public sectors, to encourage, for instance, xeriscaping in place of lawns, rainwater collection, using rooftops, and well, what else is there? I know that, for instance, soil retains water a lot better than dirt. What ways are we building soil in this city? And then one other really big question, especially when it comes to solutions for me. I ride my bicycle a lot. Part of it's because I live close to campus. The other part is I'd feel like a hypocrite showing up in a car after my student just gave a presentation talking about how we should be driving less or whatever. And so, I ride my bicycle, and then the smoke, the quality was in the red, I think, might have been worse. And I didn't think much of it. This is becoming a normal thing. And so I put on my mask, which it turns out I found out later doesn't help at all. So I put on my mask and rode my bike to school like a dork. And I coughed for the next 3 days. So I had to stop. I had to stop riding my bicycle. But the UN has made a call for city planners to make a transition from relying on automobiles to other means of transportation. And then that's a bigger question. And Boise is growing really fast. You might have realized this sitting in traffic for 10 minutes. And we're growing so fast, I'm really curious about what are we doing to think about how we're going to shift away from being so reliant on automobiles. So I guess in summary, I'm really curious about what we're doing for water conservation, for soil building, and for changing means of transportation. Thank you.
Thanks, Dave. Daryl Keenops? Great.
Thank you, Heather. Some reflections, both professional and personal. At the personal level, I think about our granddaughters when they come up from California for a nice summer vacation, and we can't see the mountains, and we shouldn't have them out in the bad air. Or from the standpoint of a lot of other citizens and the effects that you mentioned, how it's disruptive of family events, community events, and those sorts of things. From a professional standpoint, it's a question of how, and I'm a professional forester, retired, but active in this area, but how can we get by some of the myths to the realities so we can get to the solutions, or at least a dialogue on the solutions, where we listen to one another and try to work this through, because like in wildfire politics, it's almost like the military-industrial complex kind of conversation because of all the moving parts teamed up with what we need to do to increase the pace and scale of forest treatments to get to a more resilient situation. So those are a couple of reflections, Heather. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's see. And Kelsey, would you like to?
My name's Kelsey Nunez. I'm with the Climate Summit, and I'm actually pretending to be Dr. Bill Wepner right now. So I'm reading a statement from Dr. Bill Wepner, who is a staff physician and the director of the Center of Excellence in Primary Care Education at the Boise VA Medical Clinic. And he sent this case to Heather, which is about a person that he worked with during the poor air quality period of this summer. He said he had a similar but less extreme case during the same period. So in short, this is a 65-year-old veteran of the Vietnam War with known COPD emphysema from years of smoking. After learning of this diagnosis, he has quit smoking, did a 6-month course of pulmonary rehabilitation, and has been followed closely by me with input by our pulmonary department to get him on an appropriate set of inhalers to treat his symptoms and allow him to remain functional. During a peak period of particularly bad air quality in the red-purple range, he had been working in his yard as he often does in the summer. He also had to travel to a funeral for one of his best friends in another town, and on the way home stopped by another town to visit his mother at a nursing home. On the drive home with his wife, he said he could feel his lungs tightening up, and he spent the rest of his night on what he calls his peace pipe, his albuterol nebulizer, which is used as a rescue treatment when he is unable to take a deep breath in order to use the inhalers. He was up doing this almost continually until 5:30 a.m. when he asked his wife to call the paramedics to bring him to the hospital where he was admitted. After aggressive treatment in the emergency room, he was admitted to the ICU and intubated for respiratory failure. He improved with treatment and was discharged after several days. I saw him in a clinic the following week, which is still during the poor air quality conditions, but they were improving. We reviewed what had happened and discussed what he might do differently next time. He told me he had looked up an air monitoring app on his phone and was going to start using it. When I asked him what he would do when the air quality became poor, he said, "Well, I'm going to stay the hell indoors, that's for sure." For me, this was a reminder of how worsening air quality, for a variety of reasons, can put patients with heart and lung disease at risk for fairly severe exacerbations. It also was a wonderful example of a patient who was using technology to become more aware of potential risk and was willing to take the steps to address them when they arose. It also reminds me of the importance of paying attention to air quality to both educate patients and find opportunities to advocate for smart policies.
Thanks, Kelsey. And our final person here, Greg. I know, we caught you just in time. You're already standing.
Greg.
Yeah, so I work for the, hi, Greg Servine, work for the Idaho Department of Fish and Game. So we're concerned about effects that are for maintaining our species of greatest conservation need across the state and what effect some of these changes are having on some of those particular species. On the other hand, we're seeing some benefits for sure, particularly in some of our game species with milder winters. That is increasing overwinter survival, and so populations are increasing, which our sportsmen very much like. So that's a good thing, except when we have these sporadic winters, so then we get a very heavy winter, and then we have tremendous depredation problems on private lands. So on the one side, we do see some benefits. On the other side, some of those benefits have ramifications that we need to work out and sometimes aren't possible to be able to work through, and we just have to deal with the realities of the difficulties those present. And then maybe also just on the recreational side, one of the things particularly related to sportsmen and fires and such is having more opportunities for our sportsmen is fantastic, but one of the things we're increasingly facing is them being shut out because of fires and access to hunt areas because of fires and the danger that those present. So on the one side, we have the better opportunity, but then access is becoming more difficult as managers try to deal with fire and access related that way, and so that presents the problems that you can imagine. Thank you.
Thanks, Greg. So thank you again to everyone who allowed us to put them on the spot this morning, for being good sports and for taking this opportunity to share a little bit about your observations and experiences around impacts and risks of climate change. We hope that for everyone here, that as you participate in the coming sessions this morning, you'll continue to be making your own connections like this that can be shared in the breakout groups this afternoon and tomorrow. Data shows that the changing climate is having a clear impact on Idaho's economy across many sectors. And as a planning committee for this summit, it was our belief that if we could bring together professionals from as many sectors as possible to share ideas and to expand dialogue about how to address this issue, then together we could create new partnerships and identify locally based solutions. This is Idaho. We know how to work together, and we know how to solve problems. So on behalf of the Planning Committee, I want to tell you how happy we are to see all of you here today, and how excited we are that we all have the opportunity to work alongside one another to identify solutions that will protect Idaho's economy, Idaho's water, Idaho's land, Idaho's health, and Idaho's future for generations to come. The work you do and the conversation you'll have over the next 2 days are incredibly important, and they have enormous potential. So thank you for being here, and thank you for doing this work.